What is happening, Sea Road family? Hope you are good, doing well. How many of you thought it was fall this morning when you woke up? Yeah? How many of you panicked ever so slightly? I forgot to do whatever it is you do before the fall. So glad that you're here. My name's Jason, one of the pastoral staff here. If we have yet to meet, now you've met me. Hello, come say hi to me after the service. Here's the big idea that we're talking about today. This is a series that we're in this month, all about who we are as a church. Why does that matter? Like, where are we going? All that stuff. The big idea is this: perspective changes everything. Let me pray and we can go. Just kidding. You're stuck here for a while. Perspective changes everything. How many of you remember maybe when you were younger years, elementary school, looking at these images that were like a whole bunch of dots and pictures and whatever, but when you stared at them a certain way, some sort of other image, kind of 3D mode, came out at you, yes? Stereo autograms or whatever they're called. We're going to play around with them a little bit this morning to see if you've never done this before. It's kind of fun. If you have done this before, we're going to see who's got the best eyesight, essentially. So for those of you who are super competitive, let's go, right? Here's the first image. Tell me what you see when you look at this. Leaves, yes. Look past the leaves, and what do you see? What'd you say? Pineapples? Incorrect. Nobody sees the shark? It's because it's not a shark, don't worry. Perspective changes everything. Try this next one. See if you can get it. What kind of fish? A bass. Isn't it the dolphin jumping through a hoop? Do you see that? I don't see it. Try this third one. What do you see? There's a third one. That's the shark. You see the shark? Dun-dun, dun-dun. It's interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen these before. Anybody ever seen stuff like this before? You've played around with it? I remember my friend Jeremy could not see these images no matter how hard we tried to tell him, look at your finger and then follow it into your nose, go cross-eyed. Now what do you see? He's like, I just see double everything. Perspective changes everything. We're going to look at a little bit of the life of Jesus. We're going to see what we can uncover about perspective, because today we're talking about living like Jesus. The way we live our lives actually matters. And so the perspective that people have of the way we choose to live matters. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 23. I'm going to set the table before we get into this text, because this text is some of the most intense when it comes to the way that Jesus is interacting with people. Here's what I mean. Matthew 23, the context, the audience for this dialogue are the religious leaders of the day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the church leaders, the people that were kind of a part of the cultural movement of the community. The leadership that should have known better, but instead they were trying to counteract what Jesus was doing. And so Jesus does not pull any punches in this text. It's often referred to as the woe text. Because there are 7 statements that Jesus makes to this original group of people, this original audience, that are quite intense, to say the least. We're going to uncover this together because I think it identifies 4 different ways, 4 patterns in which humans live their lives consistently or inconsistently, 3 of which don't speak to the reality of knowing Jesus, and 1 that does speak to the reality of knowing Jesus. So we're going to examine those, sit in it, and see what the Holy Spirit wants to say to us through all of that, because perspective changes everything. Okay, Matthew 23 is where we're headed. The first chunk of verses, we're going to start in verse 1. I'll stop reading at verse 7, and we're just going to hit it right as it is. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So, practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." Do you see what I mean? Like, it's intense. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels, and they love to sit at the head table at banquets in the seats of honor in the synagogues. They love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi. Okay. Perspective changes everything. The first thing that Jesus talks about to the gathered crowd and community, he calls out the religious leaders and say, hey, practice what they tell you to do, but do not pattern your life after their lives. I don't know if you've ever interacted with somebody who fits into this category. I call it the greatest showman. A person that you can interact with, and they're a lot of fun to be around sometimes. There's a lot of pomp and pizzazz, a lot of hot air blowing, maybe, so to speak. Maybe a lot of charisma. And you're like, wow, they just seem to have everything together. But the closer you get to their life, the more distance you feel from maybe each other and maybe even God. Because it's all just a big, elaborate show. What Jesus was talking about here in the moment was, hey, you religious leaders, you people who say that you follow Yahweh, your responsibility was to set the course for the rest of humankind to follow after you. Instead of doing that, you're just entertaining them. You're just doing things for show. You're making sure that they call you the right name, they do the right thing. You're making sure that you have the right seat at the table, but there's no substance to who you are. I think sometimes we can fall into the trap when we try to follow Jesus of doing all of these things, going through the motions, but when people get close to us, the real us shines through, and it might not be the same as what we're speaking with our lives. Do you understand what I'm saying? Those humbling, sober moments. One of the things these religious leaders were doing is they were making sure that they were making a fashion statement. Part of the Jewish culture and heritage, they wanted to be as close to Yahweh as possible. And what that meant was at times they had to dress a certain way. Part of their dress, this elaborate gown and garments that they would put on, included these boxes that they would tie to their arms. These boxes contained different verses from Scripture that maybe were important to the individual. Maybe it was a brand idea. Maybe it was a verse that maybe kind of personified the way they, as a rabbi, were choosing to follow the law of Moses. And they would write it onto this text in this scroll, and they would stuff it into this box. And what Jesus was saying is like, look, some of you are so concerned about the size of the box on your arm that you're missing the point. There's nobody following you. and wanting to pattern their lives after yours. The greatest showman. One of the most humbling realities in our world today is if you ask somebody this question, do you want my life? And they look at you and they say, not a chance. I had a conversation with my friend Mark. He was a young adult leader in our youth ministry about 15 years ago. And God had anointed this dude with some leadership ability. It was amazing. Like, he could walk into a room. He had charisma for days. In his little pinky finger, he had more charisma than I have in my entire anatomy, and then some. People loved him. He had a goal to be an incredible teacher in a classroom. Mark and I were having breakfast one time, and I was like, hey, Mark, I really see that God is moving in your life. I see that God has really called you some really cool things. I would love to mentor and disciple you and help you to grow in that. I got a question for you. Do you want my life? And he looked at me and he said, no, I don't want all that responsibility. Sometimes when we're walking with a group of people towards Jesus, we hit a rubber hits the road moment, where as we keep growing and moving towards Jesus, they don't want to come with us the rest of the journey and the rest of the way. And that's a hard, sobering moment. Now, the cool thing is about Mark, he didn't want a piece of my life, but he found somebody else whose life he wanted to pattern after. And now he's co-vocational in education, in the classroom, and leading missions trips for young adults around the world. It's amazing to see what God has done in Mark's life. When we consider what it means to live like Jesus, we have to understand that the patterns of our lives speak to those around us. The way we prioritize, the way we decide, the way we live, the way we talk, the way we act, all those things point to what is actually significant in our lives. The question is, are we going to be like these leaders that Jesus is calling out, or are we going to be something different? Are we going to be people of substance? Or are we just putting on a great show to entertain individuals? Jesus points that out because he wants the community to understand it isn't the truth that has let them down. It's the people who've said they were following the truth. There's a second thing that he gets to. We're going to look at this next text starting in verse 8 all the way through to verse 22. Again, buckle up. It is potent. It may seem like shots fired, but remember, these are the words of Jesus, not the words of Jason. He says this in verse 8, "Don't let anyone call you rabbi, for you have only one teacher, and all of you are equal as brothers and sisters. And don't address anyone here on earth as father, for only God in heaven is your spiritual father. And don't tell anyone to call you teacher, for you have only one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be a servant. But those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others enter either. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell you yourselves are. Blind guides! What sorrow awaits you? For you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it is binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools! Which is more important, the gold in the temple that makes the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say that to swear by the altar is not binding, but to swear by the gifts on the altar is binding. How blind! For which is more important, the gift on the altar or the altar that makes the gift sacred? When you swear by the altar, you are swearing by it and everything on it. And when you swear by the temple, you are swearing by it and by God who lives in it. And when you swear by heaven, you are swearing by the throne of God and by God who sits on the throne. All right. Now you might be thinking, why the heck are we continuing to dig into this text on a Sunday? Like, am I in trouble? I don't know, maybe. Maybe not. In this extended conversation that Jesus is having now, he's moved on from this idea of a greatest showman to something that I'm going to call the speed bump. What he's speaking to specifically is legalistic behaviors and patterns in our lives. The hoops that we create for people to jump through in order for them to discover who Jesus is. And what he's saying is, he's saying to the religious leaders in particular, this isn't the way forward. It's crazy to think about how many times we have unintentionally done this. By the way that we choose to live, by the way that we choose to speak, by the refusal to acknowledge what's happening in our world. All you need to do, and I don't recommend this, but all you need to do is kind of flip on the political news right now, particularly south of the border, and you can see this personified really, really, really well. And by really well, I mean really poorly. There's an expectation, if you're an American, that you think and breathe and believe a certain way, particularly if you call yourself a follower of Jesus. There are people that would say that if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, there's no way that you could vote for that political party. And the crazy thing is, both sets of political parties believe the same thing. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're a Democrat, or if you're a follower of Jesus or you're a Republican, you look at it and you're like, oh my goodness, there's no way that you can follow Jesus and vote for that party. What Jesus is talking about here is like, listen, we have all these little nuances and subtleties in who we are, cultural flavors, those unspoken things that become expectations that we expect people to measure up to. And God is saying and reminding us, that's not the way forward. Imagine being a speed bump. We have this vivid memory as a family, driving in a country that shall not be named, with individuals that shall not be named. And it's the middle of the night. By middle of the night, I mean like 10 p.m. But it's pitch black everywhere. You can't see anything. And in this country, they had strategically placed speed bumps randomly throughout the road system. And we have this vivid memory where about 10 p.m., we hit one of these at full speed, boom, allowing one of the kids to fly forward in the van to be caught by their mother before they smashed into the back of the seat. And they stayed sleeping. Super awesome. From that moment on, everybody was looking for speed bumps. During the day, during the night, I think I see a speed bump. And you'd have to slow down to make sure you didn't hit the speed bump. And we still chuckle about it today. And if you ask my kids about it after the service, they might give you the full story from their perspective, because perspective is everything. How many times do our lives unintentionally function as a speed bump in the lives of another person? Like, I'm not talking like a cautionary good speed bump. I'm not talking about, nor will I make a declaration about what they've done around Brockville, erecting these speed trap things that help us slow us down. There's a purpose to a speed bump, but sometimes there's the reality of putting the speed bump in the wrong spot. And when you hit it going full speed, it actually creates more chaos and damage and harm than it protects or serves a community. Are there any legalistic habits in your world? Here's what I mean by legalistic. Things that aren't actually from Jesus. Rhythms, expectations that you hold dear and you actually might marry with the gospel and say, oh, this is the only way forward. Are there any things like that? I have a friend who on Sunday mornings can only listen to Christian radio. If you turn the radio on, I don't even know if people listen to the radio anymore. Mine doesn't work in my car, so I don't. But if you turn it to another channel, he freaks out. He's like, I can't, it's Sunday. It's like, okay, calm down. The person who changed the radio station had no idea that this would throw off your entire day. This is what I'm talking about. Those little itty-bitty things. It could be anything. Quite frankly, it could be a specific translation of Scripture that you want to be shared with. You want the preacher to use. It could be what kind of snacks are served after a Sunday service. It could be the brand of coffee that you have to have. These legalistic things can creep into our lives. What happened in the life of these Pharisees and these Sadducees and these religious leaders is they had a whole bunch of these things. Some of my favorite ones to kind of ruminate about or think about were these laws and adaptations of laws they had around a Sabbath practice. A Sabbath was a time period every single week, 24 hours, that was set aside as like a time of rest and renewal and holiness for the community. There was supposed to be a cessation of work of some kind. And so they created a whole bunch of different rules of what you could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. You had a certain amount of steps that you were able to physically take. And what was hilarious is they'd have people out there counting how many steps people were taking. Ooh, Derek, that's step number 57. You got 63 for the day. Just a reminder. They would do that. They would call one another out on these crazy things that were, quite frankly, unbiblical. The whole point of the Sabbath was to enjoy unbroken, unhindered time with your Creator. To step away from what was normal for your day and embrace a new rhythm, one that restored you in some capacity. It wasn't about the activities you did or didn't do. It was about Jesus. How are you pursuing Jesus in the moment? Sometimes, when we're honest, sometimes the way we choose to live our lives, we function more like a speed bump than an accelerant. Instead of propelling people towards Jesus, we're actually hindering them from encountering Jesus, because all we have inside of us are rules and regulations and expectations that are never satiated. There's always something missing. Friends, that's a heart condition issue, and that's what Jesus is speaking to with these leaders. He's saying, get outside of yourselves. Get outside of yourselves. Recognize that life isn't about your rules and your regulations. Life is about encountering the presence of the Holy Anointed One. Sometimes we just engage in activity for show, to entertain. Sometimes we function like a speed bump, and sometimes we do something that's potentially even more harmful. We're going to pick this up at verse 23, and I'm going to read to 33. It says this: "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. Blind guides, you strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build tombs for the prophets your ancestors killed, and you decorate the monuments of the godly people your ancestors destroyed. Then you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would never have joined them in killing the prophets. But in saying that, you testify against yourselves that you are indeed the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead and finish what your ancestors started. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell? Do you see what I'm talking about? Like the sassy Jesus here, okay? He's roasting people left and right. Now, here's what's interesting. Some people think that this gives us a license as followers of Jesus, if that's a label that you embrace as a part of your identity, as your identity. It gives us this license to just speak truth like a big bazooka into the lives of people. What we need to understand about the contextual setting of this whole conversation is for 3+ years, Jesus has built relationship with the religious leaders and the elite. He knows them by name. He's interacted with them. And even previous to that, there's a high probability that he was in rabbinical training and school alongside of each one of them. So there's a long relational history. There's lots of relational equity here. So when he starts spewing this truth that's really potent and really intense, it's because he's got this relational foundation to which he can actually start cashing in and speak that truth into their lives. What we cannot do is speak truth with the absence of relationship. There's something that happens in our world today called the cultural wars. There's an expectation that Christians should be at the forefront, leading the change, leading the charge, leading whatever. If we don't have a relationship, we have nothing to stand on. Perspective changes everything. The way you choose to live your life matters. The people around you matter. This third way we live our lives, potentially, that Jesus is starting to poke at with all these intense words, he's poking at the pretenders, the people that are just going through the motions. It's not about entertainment. It's not about even calling people into something. It's just going through the motions. It's a habit. It's a tradition. There's no value in the why behind the activity. There's just an absence of it. And he uses kind of 2 or 3 illustrations to personify this, to draw it out for us. First of all, he talks about a cup and a dish. And he says, listen, you religious leaders, you're so worried. You're so worried that you're going to ingest something that makes you impure, that you strain your water. You make sure your outward appearance is all put together and it looks well. The outside of the cup is clean, but inside is filthy. He goes on to call these religious leaders and individuals whitewashed tombs. The headstones back in the day that they would use were white. That's why he's calling them whitewashed tombs. This headstone, this sarcophagus, as some other traditions used to call it, they would be white in nature. They'd be whitewashed, pristine on the outside, but they contained dead things on the inside. But what he's saying to these leaders, what he's saying to us today is, are we done pretending? Are we done keeping up this idea that we've got to look a certain way, behave a certain way, that we have to make sure we're doing all the right things, but meanwhile, internally, we're stuck. We're undone. We're anything but what we're projecting into our world around us. into the lives of people who are connected to us. I wonder sometimes if we would focus more on what Jesus kind of suggests as a remedy for this pretending. He says, worry about the inside. I wonder if we were more focused on that, being fueled and filled by the actual Spirit of God, that the external would just kind of just take care of itself. Like when we come up to a relational strain of some kind, instead of trying to figure out the right words to say in the moment, what if we were like, Jesus, just help me to be present with you and fill me with your Spirit in this space, because I seriously don't know how to handle what's unfolding in front of me. Would you seep out of my presence? And if I have to use words, would you seep out of my words as well? Like, I wonder if we were so focused on instead being filled by who Jesus is, that all these other things that we invest our time in some capacity would have lesser priority and lesser value and be actually put in their right place once again. See, what these religious leaders would do is they would make sure that everything looked good on the outside. When you walk past them, they were sharp dressed. They had perfumes or oils. They made it look like they were playing this part. Meanwhile, on the inside, behind closed doors, they were trying to figure out how to maximize their earning power from some sort of temple tax. They were trying to figure out how they can continue to live in this dual reality of a Roman occupation and their Jewish culture, and what concessions they had to make morally in order to live into that reality. All sorts of tension points. And one that's going to be coming up, if you continue reading Matthew from this point, where they are involved in engineering the death of Jesus. Convincing people, Romans and Jews alike, that the best way forward is to eradicate the problem and end his life. To ironically kill a prophet in the same way that Jesus kind of in this section of text says to them, hey, you say that you wouldn't have killed the prophets like your ancestors, but he's kind of foreshadowing, saying, just wait. Just wait, because you're going to be involved in killing a prophet in a short moment from this point. See, the reality is, in one of these three spaces, we may have found ourselves at some point in time. The greatest show person, charisma, oozing, entertaining, maybe seeking entertainment for ourselves, but there's no substance behind our motivation. Maybe we functioned as a speed bump, like, hey, we've got to control everyone and everything around us, so I'm going to be that person. Maybe we functioned as the pretender, where we've done all the right things to get us all sorts of leeway and relational equity with other people, but there's no substance in what we are actually doing. We're just keeping up appearances so that nobody will ask us a really deep, meaningful question, and so that we don't have to maybe even be honest with where we are in the moment. But there is good news. There's a fourth way that Jesus alludes to and talks about. He talks about living the life of a servant. I want to reread a portion of this text that maybe you missed it when I was reading through it, because it's housed between all these really intense statements. Like, how many times can you hear hypocrites and snakes and other things, and we fixate on those things, and sometimes we miss the beauty in the moment. Here's what he says in verses 11 and 12. He says this: the greatest among you must be a servant. The greatest among you must be a servant. But those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. See, right in the middle of this intensity, in the middle of all of this really harsh language, is this beautiful picture of how we can choose to live. We could choose to be the way of the servant. Jesus himself lived this way. He lived the way of the servant. What is the way of the servant, Jason, what does it look like? It looks like patterning our lives after Jesus, who was the servant. It's taking a moment and looking at the breadth of our lives, all the things that make up our lives, where we give our time, where we give our stuff, what we choose to prioritize, how we interact with people, all of it, all of the aspects of our lives, and asking God this question: what piece of me needs to reflect you more? What piece of me needs to reflect you more? I'm going to ask for 6 volunteers. Don't worry, I'm not going to call you snakes, hypocrites, whitewashed tombs, or anything like that. Just zip up here. I'm going to ask you to actually hand something out really quickly, and I'm going to need 2 upstairs. So 2 of you upstairs, just pop up right who you are. Listen, I know people's names, okay? So if you're not going to pop up, I'm going to call you out. Yeah, just come right forward. I need 6 here, 2 upstairs. Perfect. Evan, I see you. Right on. Pick somebody else that's not Jamie. Okay? Braden, perfect. Evan and Braden. So right back by the banner there's something underneath a blanket. I want you to grab it. Each one of you, I want you to grab one of these buckets. What I want you to do is make sure that everybody gets one of these. You're going to be getting a tea light. If you want to, you could pass it back and forth. We had more than 6. Wonderful. Love it. You're going to be getting a tea light, and here's why. We've been talking about patterns of our lives. We've been talking that perspective is everything. Now we're going to talk about light. The way of the servant is understanding that we reflect what's important to us. And if we're going to call ourselves a follower of Jesus, if that's something that we are going to, again, embrace as a part of our identity, we have a responsibility and an opportunity and a privilege to reflect the nature of this servant leader, King Jesus, to the world around us. Now, here's the thing about light. Sometimes when there's too much light, you feel exposed, yeah? Anybody been like dead asleep at night, and then you have a wonderfully, motivated young child come into your room and flick on the big light? Not the little light, but the big one, right? And it goes from pitch black to like operating room brightness in a millisecond. Yeah? Sometimes the light's intimidating because that's the reality. We can feel exposed right in the moment. Like, don't ask me a real question. I don't want to feel exposed. I'd rather pretend, or I'd rather show you something different, or I'd rather focus on something negative so that you don't have to see who I am. Sometimes the light is a warning. Probably none of you have ever had this happen to you, but you're driving probably a little bit too fast down a road of some kind, and behind you, you see a flashing pair of lights, blue and red. Nobody knows what I'm talking about because you all are great drivers. And it's a warning that you've exceeded a boundary of some kind. And usually it involves pulling over to the side, a great conversation about what is or what isn't happening. Maybe you have to find some piece of paper that they want you to produce in a certain amount of time, or you have to pay more money. I don't know. But that conversation could take place. Sometimes the light causes us to be afraid. It's interesting. And sometimes we can go to like a concert. Concerts these days are crazy. Doesn't matter what type of music it is, it always involves lighting of some kind. Whether it's a laser show and it's shooting beams of light across the audience, whether they're changing colors and moving, whether you're watching your favorite singer, doesn't matter genre, it could be even terrible country music, right? And the lights are changing. Bonnie and I, one time, we went to a Coldplay concert, and they handed out these wristbands. and they had like little LED lights. They were like, oh, cool, souvenir. At a certain point in time during the show, they synced up with all the other lights. And we had our own dance party in our small little seats. It was like this, woo! It was awesome. Sometimes light can be entertaining. It can distract us. It could distract us from what's really going on. Like a squirrel. Right? Oh, look over here. What? Yeah. And then there are times when the light is comforting. I remember being at college, and college was not a fun part of my existence. It was a challenge in so many ways. I remember one late night, like really late night, early morning kind of reality, just been like, I need to talk to somebody. I've got to talk to somebody. I'm afraid of what I might do if I'm left to my own self. And so I scoured my dorm room looking for somebody who had the light on underneath their door, you know what I'm saying? Just peeking out. So you don't want to wake anybody in the middle of their sleep because you never get a good, rousing welcome when that happens. I've been sleeping for 4 hours. Why did you wake me? I just need you. Get out of here. Lo and behold, my friend Curtis's light was on. It was a nice, warm light. Right? Not the big one. And it signaled to me in that moment that I was welcome. And without that conversation, I don't know what would have happened. I think when Jesus is talking about this way we choose to live from Matthew 23, he is inviting us to consider what kind of light we're reflecting. Are we reflecting the light that just makes people feel constantly exposed, constantly afraid, constantly entertained? Or are we reflecting light that makes them feel welcome, makes them feel like they matter, makes them feel valued? If we're going to live like Jesus, we have to understand that means reflecting the light of Christ. And the way we live like him is the way of the servant. Loving people just like he does, within the framework of the abilities and the experiences that he has given to us right now. Because perspective is everything. And what the people around you see could be one of a welcoming light, a threatening light, an abusive light, or a light that actually cares. This tea light, put in your locker. What kind of light are you reflecting at your school? Bring it with you, put it in your work truck. What kind of light am I reflecting on the job site? Yeah, even that job site where you're working for people that suck to work for. What kind of light are you reflecting? Put it on your night table. If like home is the challenging spot for you to reflect that light, that warm, welcoming light, put it on your night table, or put it on your kitchen table or your fridge, or I don't know, find a big box and put it on your arm. But every time you look at it, I want you to see, I want you to hear an invitation from Jesus to reflect his light. And you can't reflect his light unless you have that light inside you. So if you don't know Jesus yet, that's where you start. And it's quite simple. It's an adventure of a lifetime, and you can simply say something like this: Jesus, today I'm starting by choosing you. I don't even know what that means, but I'm going to follow you to the best of my ability, to my growing understanding. Maybe it's for the first time in a long time. Maybe it's going back to that moment, recognizing that in some spaces in your world you've deviated from that kind of light. And it's now changing the way you think, repenting for that, and allowing Jesus to redeem those moments. I tell you this, because I am a living, breathing example of that redemption story. And so are you. Perspective is everything. What do people see when they see us? More importantly, who do they see when they see us? I pray that they see a loving God. I pray that they see Jesus. One last thing that I'm going to put in your memory banks. It's an activity, an expression that's going to help us all. Many of you who came in through the main entrance doors might have seen this big, massive map of our area. What we want to do today is get a picture of where these C Road lights are at work and at play. So it's a fun little activity we're going to invite you to do at the end of our service. There's several different colors of pins. One color is for where you live. One color is for where you work. If you're retired, use that color because you live and work in the same place. Your work is now using the time that God has given you in an abundance of the actual regular work job stuff to do whatever it is he's asking you to do. So it might be volunteering, it might be caring, it might be whatever. We want those reflected there. Some of you have family members, like young adults in particular, who are away at schools. We have a special color of pin to signify that. And we want you to take a moment to put that. So if you're at school somewhere, put that color pin. Teenagers, we want you to play too. So some of you have 3 things. You live, you work, and you go to school. Put 3 pins in. Make sense? That is advanced math 101. So why we're doing this is because sometimes it feels lonely. We feel like we are all alone trying to reflect light, and we're like, I don't even know. We come to a room like this, and we're like, I think these people are my people. I think they reflect the light that I do. But it's hard to know everybody on a real intimate basis. And so what we want to do is just create for all of us this picture of where God has deployed C Road right now here today. That's going to change over time. I get it. But it gives us a picture knowing that we're not alone in this adventure of trying to reflect the light of Christ. Because perspective is everything. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks so much for today. Thank you for the truth of your word. It is humbling, it is sobering, it is challenging. I pray that you would bless us and protect us, that you'd make your face shine upon us, be gracious to us. You'd grant us your favor and your peace. We pray this in your name. Amen.